Sam Hinkie is one of the most controversial figures in recent NBA history. Sam was the creator of the process, as he coined it, the act of essentially shamelessly tanking in order to get a high draft pick, which would in the long term land Philadelphia the superstar talent required to win championships. The reason Hinkie was so controversial was that tanking. Blowing up your roster to start with a clean slate and get a good draft pick was not a new concept, but it was the manner in which that he did this that Sam both fell under fire for and earned a lot of praise for. Like I said, the way Sam tanked was shameless. However, while there was certainly a sizable handful of missteps in his tenure with the Sixers, the team did end up making two huge additions. Joel Embiid is currently the leading MVP candidate in the league, and Ben Simmons, while possibly a bit disappointing, is still a top 25 player who is incredibly impactful, arguably the best defender in the NBA and an amazing passer. So you can't outright say that the process has failed. Though the end goal is to win a championship, you can't say that Sam did not at least get them in the position to, at the very least, contend. But that's not really the debate with Sam Hinkie. We all know that he put together a pretty damn good roster. The question is, was what he did really smart or not really at all? Tanking was not a new concept, but it wasn't done to that extreme before, and considering the amount of picks that the Sixers had, when comparing that to how many real players they actually got out of it, you would have to question if Hinkie was really all that good at anything, excluding losing. Which isn't exactly impressive, like good job on being really good at losing, but you also can't deny the results that it yielded. Was Sam Hinkie a genius or a fool? Welcome to NBA Deep Dive. Before I dive into this one, about half of the people that watch these videos are not subscribed, so if you fall into that 50%, then subscribe. It helps you see these videos in your sub box. Over the past 3 deep dives, I have had set a like goal at about 10,000. I want to see if I can continue that with this one, so please drop a like on this video. But on with the topic. The Sixers were an interesting team when Sam Hinkie inherited them. They had fallen just 4 games of the 8th seed in the Eastern Conference, with Jrue Holiday, Thad Young, and Evan Turner being the only really good players on that team. Jrue Holiday being the clear best, as he had just made an All-Star appearance, but the talent on this team was far from overwhelming. The roster was not really heading in a positive direction. Enter Sam Hinkie, who in the span of just 2 weeks selected Michael Carter-Williams with the number 11 overall pick, traded Jrue Holiday to the New Orleans Pelicans in exchange for the number 6 pick in the same draft, Nerlens Noel, as well as a future first rounder. He also hired Brett Brown as the team's new head coach. MCW would go on to peak in his rookie year, and actually his rookie debut, but you can't be too mad at this pick. Of course, he was taken a few spots before Giannis, but it would be using an incredible amount of hindsight to criticize Hinkie for that. Then he would trade Spencer Hawes for a second-round pick that would end up becoming Jeremy Grant, and they would trade Evan Turner for Danny Granger and a second, getting off of Evan's money. And the Sixers this year won just 19 games, which resulted in them getting the 3rd pick in the 2014 draft, which unfortunately meant that they would have to miss out on the luxury of drafting generational talents Andrew Wiggins and Jabari Parker. Instead, they just have to settle for measly old Joel Embiid. Now, this was obviously a good selection. It came with just 2 problems. Embiid was coming off of an injury, which would mean he would not play in his first year and eventually his second, and on top of that, this team had just traded Jrue Holiday for a young center, and they just selected another center. There was initially some hope that Nerlens Noel could play power forward, but that's just because the NBA had not quite reached the point yet where 2 real bigs was considered just a completely bad idea. Also in this draft, the team selected Elfrid Payton with the pick from New Orleans that they got from the Jrue Holiday trade, and then Payton was traded for Dario Saric, who would be a draft and stash guy. Later on, they traded Thad Young for a first and process legend Alexi Sved, who only played 17 games there, but still process legend. They also signed other process legends KJ McDaniels and Robert Covington, with Robert being a real diamond in the rough. Then in a move that puzzled a whole lot of people, the team traded MCW to the Milwaukee Bucks in exchange for a first-round pick. Apparently, Hinkie had seen that MCW was fool's gold. He thought that his jumper, being as bad as it was, could not be made up for with his all-around game, so he shipped him off to the Suns for a first rounder that would be a lottery pick later on, which could have been Mikal Bridges, but the dumbasses that followed Hinkie traded that pick for Zaire Smith. Hinkie also traded KJ McDaniels to the Houston Rockets, which basically ended his career, and I'm never going to forgive Sam for that because KJ was one of my favorite players at the time. The Sixers were once again bad in 2015, and they'd once again get the number 3 pick in the draft, where they'd once again take a center. This time it was Jahlil Okafor, meaning the team now had 3 freaking lottery centers on the roster. And in the second round, they had drafted Richaun Holmes, another center, which, by the way, hate on Hinkie's lottery picks all you want, but both Richaun Holmes and Jeremy Grant were second-round steals. Not steals that really benefited the Sixers as they were moved on to other teams, but still Hinkie knew how to spot some talent later in the draft. He also knew how to spot a bit outside of the draft with players who were undrafted, signing both Christian Wood and TJ McConnell. And I feel like I can actually give Hinkie the credit for this particular signing because he gave him a full-year contract. It was not his decision to let Wood eventually leave the Sixers, but we'll talk about that more later. But back to Jahlil Okafor. Well, he had the misfortune of having the type of player that he is become prehistoric like the day after he was drafted. Okafor is one of the most skilled post scorers the NBA has seen over the last 5 years. The problem was everything else. Bad defense, not a great athlete, no jump shot really, wasn't a great screener or pick and roll option, not a playmaker, not much of a rebounder. Literally the only thing he did very well was post up. Now, because the Sixers didn't have any better options, he did average 17 and 7 in his rookie year, but it was well understood that Okafor wasn't going to be all that special, and the already early detractors in his career would just be a cherry on top of what would really derail it. After a few years of drinking Shirley Temples and simping over Rihanna on Twitter, which honestly pathetic, who the fuck would simp over a female singer on Twitter over and over and over again like that? That's just sad, we gotta be real. After all that, Joel Embiid finally made his NBA debut. Embiid's first game was electric. He flashed more potential than people previously thought he had. While his efficiency was bad, he flashed range, good post moves, and had some serious ability to protect the basket. Another player who debuted that year for the Sixers was Dario Saric, who would end up being a solid player in his own right. But before that happened, 2 very important things happened before that. 1, Sam Hinkie stepped down from his position as general manager of the Philadelphia 76ers. But 2, what had happened the season before Embiid even debuted, the Sixers were horrible. 10-72 horrible, which resulted in the number 1 pick in the draft, which the Sixers used to draft Ben Simmons. Now, Sam didn't actually himself draft Ben Simmons, but because Ben was the consensus number 1 overall pick in that draft, like anyone who had number 1 was going to take Ben Simmons, and the fact that it was Sam's moves that led to the Sixers being bad enough to get that pick, I am going to credit Sam Hinkie with Ben Simmons being a Sixer. Meaning Sam is really the main person responsible for the Joel Embiid and Ben Simmons duo happening. Now, there's a whole lot of conversation to be had around tanking as well as Sam Hinkie stepping down. Like, it's pretty well believed that Adam Silver asked Sam Hinkie to step down. In reality, he was basically fired by the league because it was a bad look. But I don't want to dive too much into either of those. I already mentioned the Adam Silver thing, and then as far as my opinion on tanking, I think it can be bad for an individual franchise if not handled well, because it can lead to a very toxic culture. I think it was handled well with the Sixers because they did not have a problem flipping that switch towards becoming a contender, and it's definitely bad for the league just from a fan perspective of the overall league. It's not exactly pretty. But I also don't blame general managers for not caring what is good for the league. They're just trying to build a good team and sell tickets. What that means for the league's reputation isn't really their concern. But the question of this video is, was Sam Hinkie a genius or a fool? Was what he did smart or dumb? Well, spoiler alert from the king of nuance here, I don't feel strongly one way or the other. Let's lay out the case for both. Sam in his tenure from 2013 to 2016 had 6 lottery picks. Of those 6, 1 is a superstar, Joel Embiid, 1 is an all-star, Ben Simmons, 1 is a solid player, Dario Saric, and 3 fizzled out into relative obscurity, Michael Carter-Williams, Jahlil Okafor, and Nerlens Noel. I don't know about y'all, but I don't think that record is too shabby. Like, there are plenty of teams that go a decade of lottery picks and don't land a superstar or even an an all-star and especially not both. And talking about draft steals, he also managed to net both Jeremy Grant and Rashawn Holmes. I'm not going to discredit the misses in the second and late first round, but I am going to praise the hits, which might sound like me being nice here, but that's generally my philosophy with all GMs. Jeremy Grant was one of the best role players in the NBA, and he is quickly becoming a star-level player on the Detroit Pistons, and Rashawn Holmes is a very solid starting center. And Sam acquired this talent through the strategy of tanking. Love it or hate it, you can't deny it was effective, because if the Sixers did not tank, what was their avenue towards landing a player of Joel Embiid's caliber? Because I'm not seeing it. Were the process Sixers bad for the league and the league's reputation as a whole? Probably. Were they bad for themselves? Absolutely not. They built a contender from basically the ground up. That is the positive point of view. The negative one would be, yeah, sure, you landed those players, but you really made the obvious picks in that situation. Joel Embiid was the clear-cut number 3 pick after Wiggins and Parker. And Ben Simmons was pretty much the consensus number 1 overall pick. And if anything fit with Embiid-wise, if Hinkie was some galaxy brain guy like many people claim him to be, he would have probably taken Brandon Ingram, who pairs much better with Joel. So basically, both picks that Hinkie hit on were not like genius draft decisions. It was pretty much the obvious choice in both cases. And if you look at the picks that he missed on, in 2013, Giannis and Dennis Schroeder were taken after MCW. TJ Warren and Zach LaVine were both taken like right after the Elfrid Payton pick that was traded for Dario Saric. Both of those players would pair very well with the Sixers right now, especially Zach. And in the 2015 draft, especially after having both Nerlens Noel and Joel Embiid on the roster, now would have been the best time to gamble on a player like Kristaps Porzingis, or to trade down and maybe land Devin Booker and further assets, because after Okafor, the prospects took a large dip. Like, Cat, D'Lo, and Okafor were always going to be the top 3 in this draft. That was kind of the consensus, but you'd think if Sam was some sort of genius, he would have smelled the bust on Okafor from a mile away. I don't know why, but saying smell the bust does not sound right to me. But for real, an unathletic big whose only skill that was better than just okay is posting up, in 2015, Okafor types of players were not 100% dead yet, but the writing was sure as hell on the wall. Another thing is, while this is just coming from a small portion of people, I don't know why there is this idea that Sam was doing something really revolutionary. Tanking had always existed. The only thing that Sam really did was do it shamelessly for years rather than 1 or 2 years, or like trying to at least appear competitive. As for some examples of tanking to prove this, well, I have 2 historical ones. I could dive into a whole bunch of other ones, but I'm really just trying to be efficient here. Back in 1985, MJ accused the Bulls front office of trying to tank when they tried to get him to sit out the remainder of the season with his foot injury. And in 1997, after David Robinson got an injury that led to a rough start, it is widely believed that the Spurs held Robinson out of games later in the season after he had already recovered in order to land Tim Duncan. So tanking had existed well before Sam, and I don't know why it's framed as anything otherwise. So that's the negative point of view. What Sam Hinkie did really wasn't all that innovative, and if he was really some genius, he probably would have made a couple of different decisions in the draft. Pulling riskier shit is what smart general managers tend to do, because they have the intelligence to realize that those risks are going to pay off, and that's not something you saw Sam Hinkie do, and him tanking wasn't exactly genius either. So that's the positive and negative case for Sam Hinkie. What's my actual opinion? Well, it's kind of somewhere in the middle. Sure, Embiid and Simmons weren't hard picks to make, but I mean, he still made them, and while he didn't pull off any real galaxy brain moves, he wasn't dumb either. Sure, with hindsight you can say, oh, if he took Zach LaVine, then this would happen, but really, you can play that game all day, even with teams that are very good at drafting. And credit to him, Robert Covington, Christian Wood, and Rashawn Holmes were all diamonds in the rough that he found. The guy also put together the assets required for the Butler trade, by the way, so he gave the Sixers some serious bargaining chips outside of just the Simmons and Embiid picks, even if Butler to Philly did not really pan out in the long run. It is accurate to say that Sam Hinkie is a good bit responsible for the success the Sixers have had over the past couple of years, but I don't think it's reasonable to say that Sam was a genius general manager, especially not really someone who revolutionized the general manager game, at least not in a positive way. Maybe it was a little bit revolutionary just to be outright shameless about your pursuit of draft picks, nice, but I don't know how much praise I can actually give that. So Sam Hinkie, genius or fool, he's either a mix of the two or neither of them, depending on your point of view on it. This video was posted a day early over on my Patreon, so if you would like to see these NBA deep dives once a week, a day early on Thursday, then go support me over there. It is much appreciated if you can support me in that way. But if you can't do that, then of course just liking the video and of course subscribing would also mean the world. But that is the end of this video. Please be sure to like and subscribe for more NBA content like this, and cue the outro music.